The 2024 election really had a major shakeup when Joe Biden was replaced with Kamala Harris as the presumptive Democratic nominee. And ever since this shift, there has been a movement in the polls towards Kamala Harris and away from Donald Trump. So in today's video, we're going to talk about why the polls are shifting away from Donald Trump, whether these polls can be believed or not, and what Donald Trump could do to change course before it's too late this election season. So we're going to get to all of that in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So I think it's pretty indisputable at this point in time that Donald Trump has lost the great advantage he had over his Democratic opponent, who previously was Joe Biden, now is Kamala Harris. And now that Kamala Harris is the presumptive Democratic nominee, the polls have shifted because I think there was a sizable portion of Democrats who sort of had low enthusiasm about this election, really weren't energized to vote, because a lot of them thought it was a foregone conclusion that Donald Trump was going to beat Joe Biden in 2024. And now it looks like this is basically a dead heat, and Kamala Harris is now leading in the RCP aggregate, something that Joe Biden hasn't done in, I believe, a year or two, could be even longer, since the last time we saw a Democrat lead Donald Trump in the average. So if we take a look at some of these polls, again, Morning Consult, CBS, these are polls where Donald Trump was leading just a few months ago against Joe Biden. I mean, we could even take a look at where the polls were at right before Biden dropped out. A 3.1% lead for Donald Trump, 48 to 45. So that's almost outside the margin of error. And when you go by the various swing states, Pennsylvania is a huge one. Donald Trump had a 4.5-point lead. If we go over to Michigan, Donald Trump had a 2-point lead. If we go down to Georgia, Democrats had basically ceded Georgia to Donald Trump at this point. Donald Trump had a 4-point lead in this state. Arizona, Donald Trump was up by 6 points. Nevada, 6 points. So the Democrats under Joe Biden as their nominee were really bracing for a pretty brutal defeat. And now that Kamala Harris is the presumptive nominee, there's essentially a fresh start to the race. This was basically a hard reset on the 2024 election. And even though Donald Trump got shot just a few weeks ago, it seems like the political impact of that was basically null and non-existent. There really wasn't any movement in the polls. If anything, the polls have moved towards Kamala Harris since that episode, and the shift and momentum seems to be continuing in her direction. Now, if we take a look at the election map, this is where the election stands today according to RCP. So it still has Donald Trump as the winner, 287 to 251. Now, part of the reason I think the polls shifted is because I think more Democrats are excited about Kamala Harris, and even people in the middle who I think were concerned about Joe Biden's age and his ability to actually lead. I think now that he's out of the picture and Kamala Harris, who's 20 years younger, obviously has more mental acuity than Joe Biden, I think somebody like that is a lot easier to vote for against Donald Trump than Joe Biden, because some of these independent voters probably aren't very fond of Donald Trump, and, you know, maybe we're torn on whether or not to vote for Joe Biden over him just because of his mental decline. But now that Joe Biden's out of the picture, those independent voters don't have to worry about making that choice anymore. Kamala Harris is much easier to vote for than somebody like Joe Biden, because Joe Biden just projects an aura of weakness and incompetence. And Democrats behind the scenes had known this for months. And I had videos planned that I ultimately didn't upload because Joe Biden was replaced. But you had Hakeem Jeffries fearing that the Democrats were going to get landslided in the House. Even some of the Senate contenders were worried about losing their seats. Even Tim Kaine apparently was concerned about the numbers that Joe Biden was getting in his state, because there was a point in this race where Joe Biden in the polls was down in Virginia and was losing in Minnesota as well. So now that the race has a new nominee, it's been a hard reset. And it really seems to be that this was due to the candidate Joe Biden, not so much the Democratic brand, because basically Kamala Harris is just some other Democrat in the eyes of a lot of voters. And I think now you have the partisanship of the country going back to default, whereas before, I think you did have some torn independents that might have held their nose and voted for Donald Trump, or just stayed home because Joe Biden just didn't seem up for the job. And now that they don't have to make that choice, I think the polls are starting to reflect that. You've also seen, obviously, a ton of positive press towards Kamala Harris, and a bunch of fundraising has come with that. So the Democrats, I think, have made a genius move in replacing Joe Biden, because basically when Biden was in the race, this was Trump's to lose. Now it seems that this is essentially a dead heat between Trump and Harris. And Donald Trump's campaign, I think, has a lot of issues. First and foremost, I don't think J.D. Vance was really the best pick for VP. Now, granted, I think he's been getting a little bit better as he's sort of gotten his footing, but I think it was definitely a very rough start in the beginning, and there was sort of this Democratic media barrage against him that I don't think he handled very well. But now that I think he's been in the position for a couple weeks, I think he's been a lot better at challenging some of the media's narratives. Also, I don't think Donald Trump's messaging on Kamala Harris is very consistent. On the one hand, you have Donald Trump arguing that Kamala Harris is weak on crime and that she wants to let all these people out of prison. But in another breath, you'll have Donald Trump say Kamala Harris locked up too many people and was too hard on crime in California, which I think is a very poor strategy. I think if you're the Republican, it's very much in your interest to campaign as more of a tough on crime kind of candidate. That has always been the Republican mantra for decades now. So veering away from that, I think was very foolish. And I think Donald Trump would be best to go back to that. Because especially somebody like Tim Walz, who is Kamala Harris's VP pick, certainly has some things to go after when it comes to the issue of policing. Obviously, he was the governor of Minnesota during the 2020 riots, so that's certainly something to go after. And Republicans have. I think what Republicans are going to do now is try to tie Kamala Harris to Joe Biden. And she is the vice president, so she does bear some responsibility for Joe Biden's policies and obviously is part of the administration. But tying Kamala Harris to Joe Biden may be harder than I think on face value it would seem. I mean, Republicans tried to tie every Democrat in the country to Joe Biden back in 2022, and it ultimately didn't go anywhere. You know, the Republicans lost the Senate, and they barely won in the House. So, you know, Republicans really need to rethink their messaging and focus more on bread and butter issues rather than going after what ethnicity Kamala Harris is, for example, which really doesn't appeal to anyone as a very inspiring message. So Republicans, I think, are sort of in disarray because, quite honestly, Republicans have been campaigning against Joe Biden from the moment he took office. And now that Joe Biden is not the target anymore, you have to now define Kamala Harris, the new Democratic nominee, which is not as easy. And because Kamala Harris is the nominee and you don't have Joe Biden being a drag on the ticket, I think it helps Democrats in other places. You see the Senate race polls here. You know, Ruben Gallego is still leading Kari Lake. Alyssa Slotkin is leading in Michigan by 4 points. Jackie Rosen up by 4. 5 points in Michigan. 7-point lead in Pennsylvania for Bob Casey. 6-point lead for Baldwin. So, you know, you have a lot of swing states that have crucial Senate races where maybe somebody like Joe Biden on the ticket would have hurt the Democrat. Now somebody like Kamala Harris being sort of just your standard Democrat isn't going to hurt them as much because she's not nearly as unpopular. And I do think some of the favorability numbers are a bit inflated because there is sort of a honeymoon period, I believe, going on. But I think this shift in the polls can't totally be explained by just inflated numbers for Democrats and a honeymoon period. Kamala Harris does have legitimate momentum behind her. The real question is how much momentum and whether or not that momentum could carry her into Election Day. Because so far, Trump still doesn't really have an effective attack against her that's really impacted her polling numbers. I mean, the latest 2 polls have Donald Trump leading, so obviously maybe you could see the polls start to snap back. But conventional wisdom was 4 years ago, and even right before Biden had dropped out of the race, that Kamala Harris was going to be easier for the Republicans to beat. As we're seeing right now, that's clearly not the case. Joe Biden was always going to be the easiest for Republicans to beat because he was the incumbent, and you could directly tie a lot of the issues in America towards him. And incumbent presidents do get a lot of the blame for the state of the economy and how the overall direction of the country. And Americans who think the country is on the wrong track versus on the right track have a 40% advantage. So this goes to show you that Americans are not optimistic about the future right now. I think ever since the RNC, you really haven't seen Republicans construe a coherent message against Kamala Harris, and that's why the polls are the way they are. I mean, Republicans should be glad they're still leading in Pennsylvania, they're still leading in Georgia, they're still leading in Arizona, but the polls are certainly going in the wrong direction for them. And the RNC really could have been a golden opportunity for Republicans to pitch their case to the nation as to why they should be the ones in the White House after 2024. And ultimately, voters really weren't that interested. And, you know, now the polls continue to shift away from the GOP. I mean, the Democratic National Convention is in a few weeks or so. It's before the end of the month. So we'll have to see if Kamala Harris gets a convention bump. But if Kamala Harris gets a convention bump, potentially it could be her leading in the RCP aggregate by 3 or 4 points. Now, I will note, she's only up in the aggregate by 0.5. At this point in time in the election, Joe Biden was up by 7.2 and Hillary Clinton was up by 7. So if this holds, you would still say Donald Trump is likely the favorite. I mean, conventional wisdom says that Democrats need to win the popular vote by at least 4 points in order to win the Electoral College, which is why Donald Trump technically still is the favorite as of today, but the trajectory of this race seems to be going against Donald Trump and the Republicans. So there really needs to be a massive course correction here. I think Donald Trump needs to be doing more campaigning around the country. I think ever since that attempted assassination in Pennsylvania, the gears for the campaign have really slowed down. Supposedly, Trump behind the scenes has also been caught very off guard by Kamala Harris being the nominee. So, you sort of have this double whammy going on against the GOP, and it is still August. There is time for a course correction, but I think Republicans would be very misguided to think that voters aren't paying attention this early in the game, because that was the biggest core assumption that ended up losing Republicans the midterms in 2022, because Democrats got on the ground early, especially in the states that mattered, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and Republicans really couldn't compete because Republicans still have this outdated notion that voters are only paying attention to politics after Labor Day. And really, as soon as campaigning starts, voters are somewhat tuned in as to what's happening. So while I still think Donald Trump is the narrow favorite for the presidency at this point in time, again, based on the numbers, the trajectory of this race is certainly going against him. But I'd like to hear your thoughts down below on what you think, how you think this race is going to end up in November. As always, again, thank you all for watching this video. I hope to see you in the next one. If you enjoyed, leave a like down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you in the next one.